On the morning of September 1, 1939, the world changed forever. Across the border in Poland, German tanks rumbled and soldiers marched, carrying enough ammunition to last only 6 weeks. 6 weeks! That was all the Wehrmacht was prepared for, yet the war they were about to ignite would stretch over 2,000 days, engulfing the entire continent and millions of lives. Historians have long asked why Germany felt compelled to strike at that moment. The answer lies not in ideology alone, but in the fragile systems that underpinned the Third Reich. At the heart of the decision was the illusion of speed. Military planners believed that lightning could win the day, that a short, sharp conflict would secure resources and momentum before the country's economic weaknesses could strangle it. In the quiet corridors of the High Command, generals and economists alike pored over reports warning that supplies were dangerously limited, that ammunition stocks and fuel reserves were insufficient for a prolonged war. Yet those warnings were filed, dismissed, and ignored. Hitler's orders moved forward with relentless certainty, as if the country's very survival depended on immediate action. The German army itself was a paradox. It appeared invincible on paper, with tanks, modern aircraft, and disciplined troops, but beneath the veneer of strength lay glaring vulnerabilities. Most units carried only 6 weeks of shells and bullets. Logistics had been tested only in exercises, not real war. Mechanized divisions could advance, but sustaining that advance over months would have been impossible without new factories, raw materials, and credit. Every general knew it, and yet none could stop the momentum that had already begun to build inside the system. The political clock was ticking as well. Hitler's regime was not a stable structure. It depended on constant victories and expansion to maintain authority. Delaying action risked internal collapse. Economic warnings grew more urgent by the month. Germany had invested heavily in rearmament, often borrowing against the future, creating a debt-laden system that could not endure long periods without conquest. Each day without war increased the likelihood that the economic engine would seize, leaving the country vulnerable not just abroad but at home. The irony is striking. Men like Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of Germany's rearmament financing, repeatedly cautioned that the nation's economic model could only support short bursts of expansion. Officers like George Thomas, tasked with monitoring military resources, prepared reports that detailed the exact limits of German ammunition, fuel, and industrial capacity. They knew the army could not fight indefinitely, yet their analyses never altered the march toward invasion. In many ways, the invasion of Poland was as much an act of desperation as it was of aggression. As German soldiers crossed the border, the world still clung to the belief that war might be avoided, that diplomacy could contain Hitler's ambitions. Inside Germany, however, the calculus was simple. 6 weeks of ammunition dictated urgency. Delay meant risk that the economic engine would stall, risk that the army would weaken, risk that internal dissent would grow. The decision to invade was not reckless in the way popular imagination might suggest. It was calculated within the narrow window that the system allowed. Poland became the first test of a machine running on borrowed time. Every advance, every shell fired was a race against the clock. Soldiers fought with bravery, unaware that their supply lines were precariously stretched. High above, generals and economists watched the unfolding campaign with a mix of awe and apprehension, fully aware that the numbers told a story of imminent scarcity. The war that began that day would last for years, but the moment of choice had been dictated not just by strategy alone, but by the structural pressures that left Germany no option but to move forward. By the end of that first week, the reality of the 6-week supply limit had already begun to shape every decision. Logistics became an invisible hand guiding tactics, influencing speed, and forcing priorities. In a sense, the war began not just on the battlefields of Poland, but in the offices, factories, and ledgers of Berlin. The invasion was the first chapter of a conflict that would test the limits of both human ambition and the fragile structures upon which it relied. Understanding this paradox is key to understanding why Germany had to strike when it did, and why the illusion of readiness masked a much darker, more urgent truth beneath the surface. Behind the march into Poland lay a ticking economic time bomb that few outside Germany understood. The Nazi economy in 1939 was a precarious balance of borrowed credit, inflated industrial ambitions, and a desperate need for resources that the country simply did not possess. The very machinery that enabled the Wehrmacht to mobilize so quickly was fueled by financial constructs designed to postpone collapse rather than sustain long-term growth. The Mefo bills, a system of secret government debt, had allowed Germany to rearm rapidly, but they were alone with a hidden deadline. Every month, the pile of obligations grew larger, and every delay in conquest brought the nation closer to the brink of financial failure. Hitler and his advisors were acutely aware of these pressures. The economy could not survive stagnation. Critical imports like oil, rubber, and certain metals were insufficient to support prolonged military operations. Stockpiles were low, and domestic production could only stretch so far. There were reports warning that a pause in aggressive expansion would choke the rearmament effort, forcing rationing, layoffs, and social unrest. These were not abstract predictions. They were concrete calculations grounded in Germany's financial ledgers, industrial outputs, and supply statistics. Yet the urgency of these warnings only reinforced the push for immediate war. The strategy of conquest became, in many ways, an economic necessity. Poland offered more than territory. It promised the resources that Germany lacked, particularly food supplies and industrial assets. Every day of delay meant an increasingly dangerous gap between what the military needed and what the economy could deliver. Advisors like Hjalmar Schacht and generals responsible for economic planning calculated that Germany could survive only short bursts of war before its fragile financial system would collapse. This created a narrow window where striking first offered the only chance of sustaining the nation's war effort. The pressure was not just financial. Political stability within Germany relied on rapid victories and the projection of strength. The regime's legitimacy had been built on promises of national revival and expansion. Prolonged inaction would allow opposition, frustration, and doubt to grow. The war, therefore, became a tool to manage not only borders but domestic morale. Expansion was no longer simply a policy, it was the lifeline of the economic and political system itself. The interplay of finance, resources, and politics left Germany little choice but to act swiftly and decisively. Even within the military, leaders recognized the fragility of the system. Reports from logistics officers outlined limits on fuel, ammunition, and equipment, showing that any prolonged conflict would quickly become unsustainable. Yet in an unusual convergence of military and economic reasoning, these shortages were seen not as reasons to delay, but as reasons to strike immediately. Striking while the army could still advance maximized the chance of capturing the resources necessary to keep the war machine running. Every strategic calculation pointed to urgency. This urgency also shaped the very tactics employed in the opening days of the invasion. Blitzkrieg, the strategy of rapid armored thrusts supported by close air coordination, was not just a military innovation, it was an economic imperative. Speed reduced the strain on limited supplies, minimized casualties, and increased the likelihood of early success. Delaying operations would have allowed the logistical weaknesses to become disastrous. In this sense, the campaign in Poland was as much an economic gamble as it was a military operation.
The paradox of September 1939 was clear. Germany appeared to be strong and ready, yet the reality beneath the surface was fragile and urgent. The invasion of Poland was driven as much by the ticking clock of economic necessity as by Hitler's ideological ambitions. Every calculation, every decision, and every order reflected the reality that the nation's financial and industrial structures could not sustain inaction. The first shots fired across the border were not only acts of aggression, but responses to an economy that demanded movement, a machine that could not pause, and a political system that could not endure delay. By the end of that first month, the interplay of finance and military action had set a pattern that would continue for years. Every advance, every conquest was informed by the knowledge that Germany's fragile economy could not survive prolonged stagnation. Poland was only the beginning, and the decisions made in Berlin in the summer of 1939 would shape the entire course of the war. Understanding this economic dimension is crucial to understanding why Germany acted when it did, and why the invasion was not merely a choice, but a structural inevitability born from the pressures of finance, resources, and the harsh arithmetic of survival.
By the summer of 1939, Germany was running on momentum as much as strategy. The structures of the Nazi state, from its bureaucracy to its military hierarchy, had created a system that could move forward but could hardly pause. Decisions flowed from the top, often contradictory and chaotic, yet the organization itself demanded action. Ministries, military commands, and industrial planners all relied on continuous output. Stagnation was not an option. The machinery of the regime, both political and economic, had become a force that propelled the country toward war almost independently of human intention. Historians have debated whether Hitler acted out of ideology or necessity, but the evidence suggests a convergence of both. The system he built placed extreme pressure on every part of the state. Industrial managers had been pushed to increase production regardless of efficiency. Military planners were ordered to prepare for conflict even as shortages threatened to undermine readiness. Every department relied on the assumption that the next conquest would deliver the resources needed to maintain stability. Delay was more dangerous than risk. Waiting would have created bottlenecks, internal tension, and potential collapse. The architecture of the Nazi state, in essence, had made war inevitable. Tim Mason argued that social pressures and class dynamics forced Hitler's hand, while Adam Tooze emphasized the economic imperatives behind the timing. Both perspectives converge on one point: Germany's structures were inflexible. The regime could expand rapidly, but it could not tolerate pause. Administrative inertia, production quotas, and the interdependence of military and civilian sectors created a cycle that demanded action. In other words, the system itself had a momentum that was hard to resist, a forward drive that made war not only likely but necessary. The men in Berlin knew this. Advisors, economists, and generals repeatedly warned of the dangers of delay, of the impossibility of sustaining long-term operations without conquest. Reports documented shortages, predicted crises, and calculated risks. These warnings were not ignored because they were irrelevant. They were ignored because the system had become a machine that could not stop. To halt operations, even temporarily, would have been to halt the very processes that kept the Nazi regime alive. The structure demanded motion, and motion meant war. By the time German forces crossed the Polish border, the machinery of the state had already dictated the path forward. Economic pressures, military planning, and political imperatives converged to create a scenario where waiting was impossible. Germany's push into Poland was therefore not only a reflection of ambition, but a response to the constraints of the system itself. The decision to strike was simultaneously deliberate and inevitable, the product of both human choice and structural necessity.
Understanding this context reveals why September 1939 was the moment when Germany could not pause, and why the machinery of the Third Reich propelled the world into conflict before the true limits of its power could be tested.
Germany in 1939 appeared to the world as a military powerhouse, yet beneath the polished image lay critical weaknesses that few outside the high command fully understood. The Wehrmacht was modern and disciplined, its tanks and aircraft impressive on paper, but the reality of readiness told a different story. Ammunition stocks were limited, fuel reserves were insufficient, and supply chains were stretched to their absolute limits. The army could advance, but sustaining that advance over months of conflict was a different matter entirely. Every day that operations dragged on would magnify these vulnerabilities, making victory far more uncertain than propaganda suggested. The Navy faced similar constraints. The ambitious Z Plan, designed to build a fleet capable of challenging Britain, was far from complete. Battleships, cruisers, and submarines were in development, but Germany lacked the time, resources, and trained personnel to bring the plan to fruition before the outbreak of war. Admiral Erich Raeder had warned repeatedly that the Kriegsmarine was not ready for a prolonged conflict, yet these cautions were overruled by the push for immediate action. Every branch of the military had gaps, and every officer knew it, but the political and economic pressures of the regime left no room for delay. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was a striking symbol of German power, but strategic weaknesses limited its effectiveness. Aircraft were modern, but production numbers were still insufficient to sustain prolonged campaigns. Air crews were trained, but not in sufficient depth to replace losses over time. Tactical coordination with ground forces relied on speed and surprise, and any extended operation risked exposing these limitations. Even the most advanced divisions could be rendered ineffective without continuous supply and support. The Luftwaffe's success depended on operating in perfect conditions, yet every logistical misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Despite these weaknesses, the illusion of strength was convincing, both to the outside world and to many within Germany. The army's initial successes in Poland would reinforce myths of invincibility, masking the vulnerabilities that would later surface in France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. In truth, the war was being fought with an army that was only partially equipped for the reality of extended combat, relying on rapid advances to compensate for shortages in men, ammunition, and materiel. This disconnect between appearance and reality extended into planning. Officers like George Thomas meticulously documented the limits of the Army's capabilities, warning that operations could quickly become unsustainable. They understood that Germany's military machine, though impressive, was not designed for a drawn-out war without immediate territorial gains. Their reports outlined worst-case scenarios: fuel depletion, ammunition exhaustion, and the collapse of supply lines. Yet these warnings reached Hitler and the cabinet only to be set aside. The regime's momentum demanded action, even if the army itself was unprepared to sustain it. The decision to go to war, therefore, was paradoxical. Germany struck at Poland knowing its military was not fully prepared, yet believing that rapid success could mitigate these vulnerabilities. Blitzkrieg, in this sense, was both a tactic and a necessity, a way to mask deficiencies through speed and surprise. Every tank push and airborne operation carried the weight of structural urgency. Any slowdown would expose the very weaknesses that officers had tried to quantify and report. Soldiers were tasked with advancing into unknown territory, often improvising solutions to shortages in fuel, transport, and ammunition. In this light, September 1939 becomes more than an invasion. It is the story of a nation fighting against the limits of its own readiness. The army was strong, yet fragile. The Luftwaffe was powerful, yet under-resourced. The navy was ambitious, yet incomplete.
The appearance of power masked a precarious reality, and the men on the front lines, often unaware of the full scope of these constraints, carried the consequences of decisions made in Berlin. The war had begun, but Germany's military was already racing against itself, balancing ambition with the hard arithmetic of what it could actually sustain. Every push forward, every operation was a gamble with high stakes, where speed and coordination were the only buffers against disaster. Understanding the limitations of Germany's military in 1939 reveals why speed, surprise, and decisiveness were not just strategies, they were imperatives. The invasion of Poland was the first test of a system that looked formidable but had been built on fragile foundations. It was a gamble with high stakes, a calculated risk born of necessity, structural pressures, and an army that was, despite its strengths, not fully ready for the long war it was about to enter. Each push forward was a race against logistical collapse, and the success of the early campaign would shape how Germany approached every subsequent operation.
Even before the first shots were fired in Poland, the German leadership had been warned repeatedly about the risks they were taking. Reports poured in from generals, economists, and industrial planners detailing exactly where shortages would hit, how supply lines could fail, and how a prolonged conflict could unravel the fragile structures holding the Reich together. Georg Thomas, head of the Army Economic Office, produced meticulous memos showing that the Army's ammunition and fuel reserves were dangerously low, that the industrial base could not sustain a long war, and that every delay in action increased the likelihood of systemic collapse. These warnings were not abstract, they were precise, actionable, and rooted in numbers, yet they changed nothing. Hitler and his inner circle read these reports, yet the urgency of the moment and the momentum of the state rendered caution impossible. The structures of the regime, both economic and political, had become machines that could only move forward. To halt, even briefly, would have meant jeopardizing years of preparation, undermining authority, and exposing the nation to both internal dissent and external threats. The warnings, detailed and precise as they were swallowed by the larger imperative to act before the economic and structural pressures became insurmountable. Every ignored memo, every set-aside calculation became a step toward a point of no return. The paradox of 1939 is stark. Germany was both powerful and vulnerable, confident yet unprepared, advancing under the illusion of readiness while teetering on the brink of logistical collapse. The men who understood the numbers, the generals, the economists, the logisticians, knew that war at that moment was a gamble with catastrophic stakes. Yet the political and systemic momentum of the Reich left them powerless. Decisions were dictated as much by the machinery of the state as by Hitler's own ambitions. The invasion of Poland was not simply a military operation. It was the outcome of an unstoppable convergence of ideology, economic necessity, and structural pressure. By the time German forces engaged Polish defenses, the point of no return had already passed. Every advance reinforced the logic that war could not be halted. Retreat, delay, or negotiation would have risked collapse both politically and economically. The very system that had propelled Germany to the borders of Poland now demanded continued action. Soldiers, bureaucrats, and industrial workers were all caught in a tide they could neither stop nor fully control. The warnings were clear, but the momentum of the Reich's structures overpowered them. The implications of this dynamic extended beyond Poland. The choices made in Berlin in the summer of 1939 set a precedent for the rest of the war. Each subsequent campaign, from France to the Soviet Union, would be shaped by the same combination of economic pressure, structural inflexibility, and military necessity.
The early days of September demonstrated that war was no longer just a tool of policy. It was a structural requirement, an almost inevitable outcome of the system Hitler had built. Those who could see it most clearly were ignored, as the machinery of the Reich propelled itself forward with relentless force. In retrospect, the story of September 1939 is a story of warnings unheeded, of knowledge overruled by momentum, and of decisions made under the invisible pressures of a system that could not pause. The invasion of Poland was a moment when ideology, economics, and structural necessity collided, leaving Germany no choice but to strike. It was a decision that would ignite a global conflict, a war of unprecedented scale and devastation, and it was shaped as much by the limits and pressures of the Reich itself as by any deliberate human strategy. The lesson is sobering. Systems, whether political, economic, or military, can create conditions where even the clearest warnings cannot prevent disaster. In September 1939, Germany's point of no return was reached not because the nation lacked intelligence or foresight, but because the very architecture of the state left no room for delay. The invasion was not merely an act of aggression, it was the inevitable outcome of a nation racing against the limits of its own preparation. Understanding this final chapter reveals why Germany had to start the war when it did, and why the first shots in Poland were both the beginning of conflict and the consequence of ignored warnings, fragile structures, and the unstoppable momentum of the Third Reich.